What's up, guys? Doug Polk here, and welcome back for another episode of Poker Hands. Today, we're going to be diving into one of my favorite pots that was played at the Lodge on our stream relaunch week. Let's go ahead and jump into the action.
We're going to push and have Otis out, and then I go to the Otis elevator, and I see Otis everywhere. I'm like, oh my God, it's like weird.
That's a sim, right? We're living in a sim for sure.
Brad with Big Slick suited. He's starting to heat up.
It's funny at the hospital,
Already won more hands today than he's won all of yesterday through 18 hands.
Okay. Oh, that's what I see. It's funny.
Joey went on the floor, Skull Mike back in the bunker.
You start to see like the other dads that are like.
Yeah, just saw that 9s versus 8s, huh?
So you start to like. I think we were there for like 3 days or something like that. And you just see like
Terrace
the same
4 bets to
people coming out
10K.
every day.
Brad going
how's it
nowhere
going?
with
And they
Big
go,
Slick
yeah, no,
suited.
it's all good. Congratulations, by the way. Oh, you're like you just.
And all the women are just like.
Nice shot of Brad right here.
The women are just in the rooms because they can't.
Yeah, they can't leave.
Yeah, and they're just,
Here it comes.
7,000. 3 raises.
Puts in the 5 bet. What's Terrace going to do here with these suited 10-7? Already invested 10K. What is it, 17K more to go? Time to surrender, you'd imagine.
Like now it's us.
Out of position, calling a 5 bet with 10 high. Dangerous.
We had Christopher in January, my first in January in New Jersey, and it was like snowing, and I'm like driving. I'm on the highway driving like 12 miles an hour, going like. Then like for like the first couple of months,
Oh my
I'm like,
goodness.
I was like, wake up
Makes the
from
call.
The call with 10-7 suited.
Now then you have like more kids.
We have a
it's like,
55K pot, Rick.
Our hand begins at 200-400 with a $400 big blind ante, and the action opening up with Terrace in the hijack raising with the 10-7 of hearts. This is a little bit loose of an open. As you get into some deeper stack scenarios, it can make sense to throw in some hands like this from time to time, but typically speaking, this is a hand you're probably going to want to let go in the hijack. Action folds to Brad in the button. He looks down at ace king of clubs, definitely a hand you're going to want to 3-bet, and he does decide to bump it up. Brad makes it 3,000 to go here. I think this might actually be a little bit small. Typically speaking, in position, you want to re-raise to something like 3.3x. With the ante in there as well, I think it probably gets a little bit bigger. I imagine that you might want to make it more like 3.5 or 4x. That said, a smaller 3-bet size does let you play a bit wider of a range, so there's not really that much of a difference between these options. No matter how you want to dice it, ace-king suited, definitely a hand you need to raise and build this pot. Certainly a value bet, and of course, knocking the blinds out who might call and just be able to hit random pairs versus you, well, that's a pretty good result as well. The action now folds back to Terrace, and typically speaking, this is a hand that you're just going to want to let go. It's probably around the bottom of your open range, and then also you don't really have good removal against the value bets in your opponent range. But Terrace does decide to go ahead and put out the 4-bet, an aggressive maneuver, and possibly trying to capitalize on the fact that he is typically one of the tighter players at the table. In most of these sessions, he was one of the tighter players in VPIP, but it just shows you how misleading that stat can be, where you might see someone is playing 90% of their hands, but if they're playing them aggressively and they're occasionally making moves like this, well, they can actually be much wider than you might imagine when you're watching a stream. Anyway, Terrace does decide to go ahead and make it $10,000 to go, and the action is back over to Brad with ace-king of clubs. Bit of a weird spot now for ace-king, because if he 4-bets, he essentially has a few different options. He can 4-bet very small, 5-bet very small, in which case he can also have bluffs and have value bets. He can 5-bet a bit larger, in which case it's going to be a little harder to bluff, or he can just jam. Brad decides to go ahead and make it $27,000 here with ace-king of clubs. I'm not a huge fan of this size. I think he should either be jamming or making it more in the vicinity of $22,000, $23,000. My logic is simple. By using the smaller size, you let yourself have room to bluff. And when you have about $90,000, $95,000 stacks, it's kind of hard to make it $27,000 pre-flop and fold with too many hands, because you're simply going to be getting pretty incredible odds if your opponent does decide to jam. If you had something like $100,000, $110,000, $120,000 behind, I wouldn't mind this size as much. And this is a good rule of thumb at home. Typically speaking, you want your 4 or 5 bet size to be either about 1/4 of your stack, or you want to just be jamming it yourself. Either way, this is a little bit big, and maybe Brad's actually doing a little bit of an exploit here, thinking that once Terrace is in the pot, he's likely going to be continuing. If I make it a bigger size, he's going to continue a bit wider. And it's kind of hard to argue with the results from here, because after making it 27,000, now Terrace in a spot where he should clearly let his hand go, but Terrace has other ideas.
And a 10
Oh, my
right there
goodness.
for Terrace.
Oh, my goodness.
10-6-9
Yeah,
Skittles.
your boy's going to be a tank. Like
Best
River.
case
Like,
scenario
he's
for
big,
Terrace. Backdoor hearts as well. Will Brad fire in a very, very small C-bet or elect for some pot control and see a free card to get to the turn? He's reaching. I like a very tiny bet, but he's going for more than that.
But like he's like big.
Built like you?
Yeah, he's big. Yeah, he's strong too. It's the way he crushes the ball is insane.
Terrace laid one down earlier against Brad.
Can't lay this down. You're never calling a 5-bet.
He had trips.
Yeah, but
Last time.
if you call a 5-bet for heaps pre-flop and you have top pair, why are you ever calling the 5-bet pre? So
Top pair and a gut shot.
She's like her.
Terrace might stuff it on him, and he does. All in, and that's going to shut it down. Brad cannot continue when Terrace goes all in here.
Like probably like 60 yards, 55 yards, something crazy.
Sick.
Counting his stack here, big pots, 153,000 now in the middle with all of Terrace's chips. Has Brad covered? It's about 50K for Brad. He hates it. Worst case scenario, ace high. Does have some overcards and some backdoor clubs, but I mean, for all of it, calling it off with ace high.
The flop comes 10-9-6 rainbow, just about the best possible scenario for Terrace that he could be hoping for. Brad has ace-king suited and has missed. And additionally, he has paired up with a gutter and a backdoor flush draw, a really big flop for 10-7 of hearts. Terrace checks as he should do with all of his hands, and now Brad has a really, really difficult spot. This is actually a spot that kind of reminds me of some tournaments where he has slightly more than pot left behind. If he jams, he'll only get called by better. If he bets small and his opponent jams, he's going to be priced in or at least have to deal with a very shitty price situation where he's likely behind, but even if his opponent has a hand like jacks, he'll of course have essentially any ace or king and also the backdoor club draw. And then it's a possibility his opponent jams a hand like queen jack suited or king jack suited where he actually does in fact have the best hand. In this spot, I think that when you 5-bet, and this is a good rule of thumb, guys, when you 4-bet or 5-bet, especially things like 5-bets, typically speaking, you should be betting almost every single flop. There may be a couple exceptions on boards like queen jack 9 where a lot of the 4-bet range or call theory range gets there, whatever you have. But on the vast majority of boards, you're simply going to want to bet the flop. And the reason is that when you 5-bet somebody, you should have aces and kings a lot. If you don't, that's a pretty huge mistake in your 5-betting game. It's also worth noting here that if Brad had ace king off, I think he should be looking to just jam pre-flop quite a lot. This 5-bet size should be hands like aces, kings, a bit of queens and ace king suited, and then some bluffs that he's working in there as well. When your range has so many aces and kings, you want to bet aggressively because if Terrace has a hand like ace jack, well, actually you're ahead of that one, so maybe that's not the best example, but a hand like 6-5 of clubs or maybe also ace king or things like that, you're going to put him in a very difficult situation. And then when you do have a hand like aces or kings and your opponent has a hand like some sort of pair, they might think they have fold equity by check jamming on you. So a good rule of thumb, if you 5-bet, c-betting almost every flop is going to be a reasonable strategy. Brad does decide to go for something around a 1/3, a little under 1/3 size c-bet here on the flop. I think I would advocate for a slightly smaller size. The reason is that when you do represent such a polar range, you really don't have to worry too much about the size that your opponent is getting to call here. Typically speaking, when you look at 4-bet and 5-bet pots, the c-bet size is very small because there's not very much money left behind, right? It's going to be easy to get this money in. In fact, you could just jam the turn if you want. And so I think maybe something more in the vicinity of 10, 11, 12,000 might be the play here. It's also worth noting there is probably some merit just to checking back the flop, but I don't really like that. I think if you 5-bet, you can be c-betting your whole range and it'll be just fine. Anyway, Brad does bet 17,000 and now Terrace with his top pair and a gutter. Realistically, with this much money out there and a hand that's this vulnerable, I think check jamming is probably the best play. You could maybe argue for occasionally calling to let your opponent continue bluffing. But if your opponent has a hand like ace-king, knocking them off their equity or forcing them to call with their equity are both great situations for you because you don't have to play some awkward turns and rivers. Terrace does decide to go ahead and check raise all in. And back over to Brad with ace-king here. Once again, he's in a nightmare scenario. In a situation like this, you really have to think about all of the hands your opponent can have and think about your direct odds you're getting to call in the pot. In this situation specifically, there are a lot of hands terrorists can have that you're doing it reasonably okay versus. For example, even in this scenario, you can hit any ace, any king, any club to win. Additionally, there are some chances of draws, right? There's certainly queen jack suited. If there's 10-7 of hearts, there's probably jack 8 of hearts, jack 8 suited kinds of hands. Maybe every now and then terrorist gets out of line with a hand like king, queen, or king jack, although those are probably a bit less likely. Those are certainly also in the realm of possibility. There's also some chance your opponent just has a hand like jacks or jack 10 suited. And once again, your ace, king, or running clubs are all going to be good outs for you. So now that Brad is facing this jam, he just has to do a little bit of math here and think, what is a range of hands that my opponent can have? And do I have enough equity to call here? Given the odds that Brad is facing, he needs to have just about 27% equity against terrorists to be making this call, which is actually not that much equity, right? If your opponent shows you jacks, you have 6 outs to your ace or your king. That's roughly about 24%. And then you also have about 4% on your backdoor flush draw. So if they show you jacks, it's just about a call really here with ace king. The question's going to be, how often is it a draw where you're ahead? And how often are you going to be totally destroyed? For example, if terrorist trapped aces preflop, you're in a terrible situation. Or if terrorist flopped a set, you're in a terrible situation. But I do think things like sets, straights, and aces, I think those hands are actually a lot more likely to just call on the flop. If you have this board locked up, like let's just say you have 8-7 of diamonds, are you really check jamming the flop? Or wouldn't you rather call, let your opponent bluff if they're bluffing, or get there if they have ace king, or value bet the turn if they have a value bet? I think we can pretty heavily say, I think we can say pretty strongly those hands are a lot less likely. So I put together what I think the range roughly might look at. Let's look at the equity. Here you can see the range of hands I'm giving terrorists that he might check jam the flop with. And we're being a little bit liberal on the bluffier hands like king, queen, or king, jack. But then we're also putting in some hands like occasionally a set or the nut straight, as well as some ace 10, ace 9 suited kinds of hands that would really have Brad crushed. I think this range, it's really tough to know, guys, because when terrorist wakes up with 10-7 of hearts, it's just so hard to say what his preflop range really looks like. But given this very crude way of looking at it, and then looking at ace king of clubs equity against that, you can see he actually would have 29% equity to call versus this range. So if terrorist was this wide, then you would be roughly looking at a call. Also worth noting, if you take out the king queens and king jacks, it's just about dead even on the call. So I guess the cliff notes here are, this is a very difficult spot for Brad, and poker can be tough sometimes, right? Where you get a series of tough spots in a row. I would probably have played Brad's hand a little different in some of the sizes that he used. I think I'd probably use some smaller sizes, but the bottom line is you're looking at right around the cusp either way. So Brad does make the call, and let's see if he can get there.
Makes the call.
Oh, my goodness.
$192,000 here.
Oh, my goodness.
Wow. And we're doing it one time.
Okay.
And we're doing it one time, he says. Terrace is a savage. One time for Max Payne. Will there be
king or backdoor clubs here, running straight.
There's
one
a club, so plenty more outs now for Brad.
Something exciting. We want to see something exciting. Thank you.
Terrace will take all of
I
Brad's
guess it was
chips.
exciting. I don't know.
Thank you for joining me for Poker Hands. I'm going to review some hands of the Lodge, but I'm also going to do some other channels too. I'm going to talk to some different streams and see who's cool with me reviewing their hands. I think my content's transformative, but regardless, just want to make sure everything is cool because I want to be friends with all the other streams. So thank you guys for tuning in, and we're going to be analyzing a bunch of content here and maybe covering a little bit of news too, so stay tuned. It's great to be back.